Okay, let's bring in you in the audience. Maybe you have a little bit more light. Sorry. Yes, okay. So,
agreed on that too.
Professor Fair first, and then over there.
So, I very much like this notion that we need a shared sense of identity and a shared sense of purpose, and that this is an important condition for prosperity. But I mean, it also needs much more. So I mean, we need. There's almost. I like that partly, but I also doesn't like it partly. There's almost no economics in that anymore. I mean, China did much more than having a shared sense of identity and a shared sense of purpose. I mean, they introduced markets, for example, and they got rid of an inefficient state sector in several industries, not as much as they wanted or is necessary. So there was a lot more to that, and I think that should also be mentioned in a sense, and maybe you have a view on that.
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, if you scratch me, I'm an economist underneath, right? But I've come to believe that good economic policies can only be adopted if you actually do the work of changing people's ideas. So let me give you the example in China. As you say, the vital thing in China was markets, right? Introducing markets. Now, that was completely against Mao's ideology. What licensed that shift? It was a narrative, a very simple narrative. And the narrative was, it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches the mice. Now, here's my evidence that that was the thing that was decisive. I teach both the economics and this social psychology stuff now in Oxford graduate level. And so one of my Chinese students this last year decided he'd put it to the test. So he did a survey of all the Chinese students in Oxford, which are now rather a lot, right? And he said, what summarizes China's economic policy? And he didn't specify any choices. Did people say markets or something like that? 2/3 of them said black cat, white cat. Right? This is a narrative which was put out in 1978 that is still resonant. So that's what's sort of licensed. If we're going to be pragmatic, then of course, let's try markets. If they work, great. Let me give you one more example, then I'm shut up. The most successful natural resource country in Africa by a mile is Botswana, right? Which discovered diamonds and saved and invested. It's now got a $7 billion Pula fund, $7 billion, little country that's saved and invested the diamond revenues, right? That's very unusual, almost anywhere, right? How did it happen? Well, it happened because the leader, Seretse Khama, was a great man, and he recognized when they discovered diamonds that what was going to happen was pressure for a bonanza. And so he introduced a very simple narrative that every Botswana knew, it's the equivalent of black cat, white cat. But what was it in Botswana? It was, we're poor, and therefore we have to carry a heavy load. Right? Sounds very simple. We're poor, and therefore we have to carry a heavy load. What are people saying in Kenya and Tanzania when they discover oil and gas? We're rich, we don't have to work anymore. It's almost verbatim the opposite of we're poor, and therefore we have to carry a heavy load. By putting that idea out, that narrative out, he preempted anybody else saying, we're rich, let's throw a party.
Alan?
Yeah, but parties, the mayor of West Berlin, Berlin, it was United Berlin, sorry, put out the idea 15 years ago, Berlin is poor, but it's sexy. That worked too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great narrative. Now, unfortunately, we're no longer poor and no longer sexy. But I wanted to tell me about jobs in Jordan, because here you really do get the problem of what jobs and culture. Because I was talking to a lady who manages a a Swiss-run hotel, actually, in Jordan. And she said, "Now, the problem is this. I can't get cleaning personnel because it's beneath the dignity of an Arab man to do the floor. And he won't let his wife or his daughter out of the house, and certainly not to clean other people's floors. So we get Filipino women. They come from the Philippines to clean the floors of hotels in Jordan, where there's millions of people not working." And then she said, so what they want is a job at management level. So if I ask, and I think we heard this before, she told me, so if I give someone a job, the first thing he wants is an office with a telephone, and then he shuts the door. And then he calls all his relatives, and then he says, you know, I want him and him to get a job too. So she said, if I employ someone from Jordan, the first thing I do is, I say to him, and it's always a him, you have to go to, I can't be Swiss run because I said go to London, go to London and work in a hotel there, so you see how it's done. Because they're not allowed to go into an office and shut the door and telephone all day long. There they have to be there for the customers. So that she has to really work on changing basic cultural attitudes in order for this hotel to benefit anyone except tourists and herself.
The gentleman over there.
Jörg de Spiegler. I have a question to Alan Posener, who described Israel's society as very characterized by variety and people full of passion and willingness to act and so on. I have a speculative question. If all the defense institutions, the IDF, the Mossad, Shin Bet, and all that would be reduced, let's say, to a level like Switzerland, how would Israel's society look like?
I think the question is, if Switzerland was surrounded by enemies the way Israel is, what would the security apparatus in Switzerland look like?
No, my point is that those organizations define the threats, and currently it is impossible, as far as I know, as a journalist, to put any question mark on what happens without being stigmatized. So
No. I'm not going to call you an anti-Semite because you happen to think that there's too much security apparatus in Israel. But the point is, we've had a test case of this. In Germany in the 1970s, there was a terrorist threat from the RAF, not the Royal Air Force, the Red Army faction. This is a small group of people who, yes, killed quite a few people and blew up this, that, and the other. And the whole country went into lockdown, right? The whole country went into lockdown. Huge increase in the security apparatus and so on. We sacrificed a leader of industry in order not to have to deal with these terrorists. We let him die. Rather than negotiate his release and so on and so forth. So we know actually how civilized European countries react in the face of a smallish threat. Look, if Israel had peace, would it be bad for the country? I doubt it.
Please, Professor.
So, I very much like the extent to which you emphasize the importance of having shared identity and common purpose, and Paul Collier also emphasized that this has to be aligned with the level at which political decisions are made. Now, the thing that troubles me a little bit, and here's my question, is that the only part of the world that has really pushed this successfully, both the identity of the decision-making at the political level and where the identity culturally lies, is Western Europe. And it has emerged after a period of 300 years where basically every single year you had a great power war with thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of casualties. And maybe one of the reasons why these things are falling apart now is that we have had 50 years of peace. So can you sort of show me a way how we can get this sense of identity and common purpose and alignment of political decision makers in a way that's not half as bloody as the one we've seen?
Yes, I don't think you need violence to build shared identity. And I'll give you two examples. One is Singapore, where Kuan Yew, he's my all-time absolute policy Nobel laureate, as it were. But when he came in 1961, Singapore was a bitterly divided society, divided on ideology between communists and capitalists, divided ethnically. It had just been thrown out of the Malay Federation, and it had a terrible reputation for corruption. And Lee Kuan Yew is actually a perfect example of the combination of very effective and persistent narratives, narrative communication, and very powerful signals. How did he get rid of corruption? He found that the main financial backer for his election campaign, once he was elected, that main financial backer used his position to start to be corrupt. So he was faced with this desperate issue. What do I do with my main financial backer? Well, what he did was jail him. Right? Jail your friends. That's the signal. Right? Anybody can jail their enemies. It just tells you don't like your enemies, right? But jail your friends and then have a narrative, we're not tolerating corruption from anybody. That's very credible, you know? So that's one example. Let me give you one quick other example. Nyerere in Tanzania. Nyerere is utter tragedy because when he came to power, he said, I haven't got a country, I've got 50 tribes. And this first year, he didn't even take up the presidency. He just spent the first year going round the country telling all the tribes, think of yourselves now as Tanzanians. Right? And then he did very practical things. Kiswahili as a common language. Right? A rule that you could not work, if you were in the civil service, you could not work in your own region, i.e. in your own tribe. And so he built a sense of shared identity. We've been able to do research on testing that, and we know it worked. Right? He built shared identity. He built a narrative of a norm of reciprocal obligation and a sense of shared purpose. If we all do this, this will happen. And the tragedy with Nyerere was he got his economics all wrong. Very understandably, because it was the zeitgeist in economic development of the 60s. And he thought that by import substitution, he'd develop fast. And that's what he told everybody. And instead, it produced an economic catastrophe. And because the narrative was no longer credible, if we all do this, then this wonderful thing happens, the whole thing unraveled. But he did the hard things and then just got the easy bit, the economics, damn it, wrong.
May I just say one thing, because of Lee Kuan Yew, I grew up in Kuala Lumpur, and my personal hero is Tunku Abdul Rahman, who engineered Malaya's independence, the Federation of Malaya as it was then, from Great Britain, and did it in such an incredibly peaceful way. I was there during the transition. I was only a kid, but one day we were singing God Save the Queen in our primary school, and the next day we were singing Negara Ku. I still know the words, and he had a narrative of a multicultural, multinational Malaya, which lasted for quite a long time. I don't know, it's breaking down now, but it helped during transition. I'm just saying,
absolutely.
He was a much nicer person than Mr. Lee.
Please, gentlemen, over there.
Now, you talked about shared identity. Now we have a lot of Muslims coming here. They are paid by Turkey, by Erdogan, and they want to introduce the Sharia. Now, how you deal with that? And when they vote here, those with double passes, they vote for Erdogan, which has little eccentric ideas. Now, how can we have then, under these circumstances, shared ideas?
Brings us back a little bit to the notion of light couture. Although you didn't like that, but I mean, how to integrate and what is the duty of the migrant?
Yeah, I think migrants do have a duty to integrate in the sense of understand the obligations that are shared in the society and adhere to them, and get a sense of a we that is larger than their own group. The importance of we is not just the reciprocal obligations, it's the trust, it's the idea of a degree of empathy with others. I think that's perfectly possible to build, but there's an obligation on anybody who comes into a new society to absorb that set of reciprocal obligations. And it's worth saying that that's the obligation, but it has to be a doable obligation. I mean, you know, it can't be your obligation is you've got to eat pork, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'd like to say something about Sharia. There is a modern country that has Sharia law for property issues, marriage, all the stuff that Sharia is meant for, and this country is Israel. Israel does not have civil marriages, so if you're a Jew, you have to marry in front of the rabbinate, and if you're not a Jew, for instance, if you're Muslim, then Sharia law applies. And the imams in Israel, they do all sorts of property issues. You can elect one way or other. This sort of demonization of Sharia is incredible. I mean, for hundreds of years, Jewish communities lived in Poland and in Russia and the whole of Eastern Europe, and the rabbis decided marriage issues, property issues, often even criminal issues. They had their own language, Yiddish. They didn't speak the language of the people around them, Polish or Russian or whatever it was. And this worked for hundreds of years. There's no reason why a modern democratic state should not be capable of doing what Tsarist Russia managed to do. Now, within reason, as long as someone accepts, at the same time as accepting Sharia, accepts the rule book of behavior, that is the civil law of the land and the principles embodied in the Constitution, why should they not go to an imam if they want to have a divorce? And in fact, talking about integration, would it not help integration if we said, look, these are our laws, and they're not so very different from the laws of Turkey or wherever. I mean, you're not allowed to steal in Turkey. You're not allowed to libel someone in Jordan. But if you elect to have your marriage affairs done by the imam, and if your wife or prospective wife elects that too, why not? Who's the poorer? And as far as for voting for Erdogan, Europe has a deal with Mr. Erdogan on the question, I mean, he's keeping all these refugees from our shores, so why accuse a Turk of voting for him? I don't understand the problem.
We have chance for a last question, the lady over there, please.
Thank you, Margareta Jeniak, Horizon Group. My question is, how do you balance the shared identity, which very often has a nationalistic or nation-wide narrative, right, around the nation? How do you balance it with globalization that has brought so many economic benefits?
No, that's a good question. Nationalism doesn't have to be aggressive. Nueris wasn't aggressive at all. And there are some common purposes that have to rise above the nation. And so you can think of belonging and identity as the layers of an onion that coincide with the different levels of purpose. You know, for a lot of cooperation actually it's at the city level. Now, the cooperative movement, which I think is a wonderful movement, it's the very essence of reciprocity, that started city by city and then gradually moved to being national. But increasingly with globalization, some things move beyond the nation. And so trade, we've moved to try and build reciprocal obligations on trade. We've got a lot of reciprocal obligation organizations. Now the danger, I think what's gone wrong at that level is that because there's big asymmetries of power within the world, there's always the temptation for the really powerful countries to sort of hijack what was a reciprocal obligation international structure and turn it into an imperial structure. And we've seen that. We've seen that within Europe. We've seen that globally. I see it very much in the poor countries I work on with. They're at the receiving end of orders. You know, and that's a denial of reciprocity. It's the capture of what was reciprocal organizations for a different purpose.
May I say something to that?
Very brief, very brief.
I wrote a book about Europe on empire, but I used the term positively because I think there are empires in history, like the British Empire, but especially the Empire of Austria-Hungary, which actually function much better than nation states. So imperial, I think, shouldn't be a purely negative term, because anti-imperialists are often so stupid.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sir Paul Collier and Alan Posener, for this debate about culture as a potential key factor for a prosperous society. And you are now kindly invited for a reception just opposite in the other hall. And I ask you to be precisely at 5:30 back here in the room for the final lecture of today's forum.